Well, welcome everybody to Discussions with the Dean, a opportunity for me as the academic dean at Memphis Theological Seminary to invite friends in who have books that they have written and to have some fun discussions with them along the way. So we've in the past had some discussion with Dr. Andre Johnson. We'll be having another one with him. He's pretty prolific. We'll have one in December. Dr. Carmichael Crutchfield will be coming up in a couple of more weeks. We talked with Reverend Murphy Davis in her book towards the end of August. And tonight we have Scott Lencke, who is here to talk with us about his new book, Reflections of Emmanuel. And I guess I should introduce myself as well. I'm Dr. Pete Gathje. I'm the Vice President of Academic Affairs, Academic Dean here at Memphis Theological Seminary. So welcome to everybody. We're going to begin the discussion after a short video that Scott is going to share that will introduce us to the book. So go ahead, Scott, and glad to have you here. Great, thank you, Scott. So I'm going to jump right in, and as I do this, I'm going to say to all the participants out there tonight, the attendees, feel free through the chat feature or the Q&A feature to ask questions of us as we go along. We're hoping for a robust conversation tonight of this important book. To help us start to prepare for the season of Advent that leads up into Christmas. So, Scott, I'm going to begin with kind of a biographical question of what led you to write this book? How did this book emerge for you?
Well, I wish I could say just as Mary had an encounter with the angel, that was not what happened here for me. It was a lot more simple, and it's actually, I would say, maybe twofold. First, over many years, being both an educator as well as I was a pastor for a season, about 5 years. Obviously, in this season, leading up to Christmas, was definitely writing about and teaching or preaching about these things. And so there's a lot of material in my back pocket, if you will, that I've thought about, reflected on for many years. But something else that really brought me to kind of put this book together is the more of, I would want to say, the newer focus in my life and of the church calendar, the church's rhythmic kind of movement across the year that begins with Advent. And so that was something that's really been on kind of my heart, my mind. It's probably familiar with many folk, but also can be very maybe not as familiar, not so familiar with others. And I would probably say only slowly over the last decade has it become more familiar with me of understanding this kind of thing. And so I kind of decided to put out the book to address both that aspect of what is Advent, how does it play a role in the life of God's people, the church, but also offering some reflections literally on specific passages that deal with the season. So.
So one of the things that might be helpful for all of us is for you to just explain a little bit of what's meant by that little phrase, liturgical calendar. For those of us who grew up, like I did growing up Roman Catholic, it almost second nature to use that phrase. But if you're in more of a free church tradition, Baptist, for example, it might not be part of one's tradition. So what is a liturgical calendar?
Yeah, so in my attempt to explain it, liturgy can sound like a really traditional word. And again, coming from a more Protestant evangelical context, it's not a word that you hear. And if you do, it sounds, how can I say, meant to put you in your spiritual grave. Like it's what all those older churches, maybe Catholics, had done, and perhaps some Anglicans and some high church Presbyterians or various other things. But we don't do that. That's not fresh and relevant. But liturgy, I think, really is a word that I like to use in the place of liturgy is rhythms, but it's things that are set in place by the church to help us, form us, and shape us. Now, in our world today, we have a plethora of copies of Bibles. We have access to hundreds of translations on our phones and mobile devices. And we can read and write generally as a people, but you have to remember a long time ago, no one had copies of the Bible. And also, people couldn't read and write a lot of times. And so the church found a way to set a rhythm in place, a liturgy, a rhythm in place that would help shape and form the people after the story of Scripture, and particularly embedding it in the story of Christ starting out and then moving all the way around from Advent to Christmas to Epiphany to Lent to Easter, and then the season after Pentecost, common time, if we will, that we focus on the church and its mission. And so liturgy, I think, is something that's given, rhythms given to shape us and form us. And the calendar is just following it. We all have calendars. We have an annual calendar. We have a school calendar. We have a fiscal calendar. We have lots of calendars. But this is one that I think, has been handed down to help shape us. And if any of that didn't make sense, I'll put a little link here that you can watch later. We don't need to watch this video now, but it's a video done by an Anglican priest. It's about 3 minutes. I think he does an amazing job telling what the church calendar is and why we have it. So,
yeah, I think one of the powerful things in the book that you have written is to lay out the place of Advent within the liturgical calendar, within the rhythms of our lives, and you begin the book by speaking also to other rhythms that are trying to form us and do form us. And one of those you point out, you'd say it's no surprise that the church in modern America has embraced the spiritual practice of consumerism itself. And then you spend a little time talking about how Advent is an antidote to that spiritual practice of consumerism. Could you share with us a little bit more about that and sort of how you see that religion of consumerism or spiritual practice of consumerism as how it shapes us, and then how Advent is challenging that shaping and trying to shape us in a different way?
Yeah, another interesting phrase to maybe capture what consumerism is, and I talk about this in the book, very formative person originally to think about what liturgy is was Jamie Smith. He's a philosophy professor at Calvin College, and his book, Desiring the Kingdom, he talks about the mall religion.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we live in a world today where malls are just not that important, but when you, not as definitely as important as when I was in high school. That was where you went on the weekends and hung out, and that's, but still, I think we can grasp the mall religion idea. And he talks about how the mall is shaped in American society to draw us in and form us. And the mall gets it maybe sometimes more than the church does, because it finds a way to touch into all of our senses, what we see, what we taste, what we smell, what we touch, and what we hear. And it is competing for our hearts, our minds, our bodies. And a message that really comes through, I think, is you want more, right? We've got more stuff. And so there's nothing wrong with having material things. Everything created is good and can be used for good, but anything that becomes an ism becomes like an ideology and something we give our full affections to. And so that's what I mean by consumerism, is where we find ways, and this season is typically highlighted by ways in which people who already have get more over and above people who don't have being given to, and trying to find a way that in Advent, even with Advent calling us to wait for Christmas. The other night I saw a commercial already with snow in the background, and it was already pulling at our heartstrings. Now, I don't know how this is pulling at anybody that I know's heartstrings, but basically the gist of the commercial was a guy came out and he surprised his wife, and she looked out in her driveway and there were two brand new vehicles, and the sticker price that was put on the commercial was starting at $45,000. I thought, wow, dropping 90 grand on Christmas, and that kind of encapsulated of, if we'll listen and watch, we're going to be pulled into this. And I think Advent says, again, let's celebrate with gifts, celebrate and loving each other with gifts. I'm not against that, but the consumerist side of it, of wanting more and more and more, and the hustle and bustle. And Advent says, let's patiently wait for Christmas.
Mm-hmm.
So.
And that's really loved how early on in the book, you talk about waiting, and waiting as a spiritual practice. And of course, we're doing a lot of waiting right now, of a different kind, but it's still a waiting, and we're not very good at it, apparently, whether we're Democrats or Republicans or something else, which is probably where a lot of us are, is something else. What do you mean by waiting and as a spiritual practice? What's entailed with that practice?
Well, the word waiting and hoping are actually the same word in the Bible. Some translations use waiting, some use hope. So waiting is a practice that shows that things maybe aren't like they should be in the biblical sense. And we have a hope. Sometimes we question that hope. We sit in that tension. We have questions. We struggle. We are frustrated. We're angry. We're sad. We're fearful. But waiting entails a longing for something better, because we know there's something better. We know, especially what we see through Christ, ultimately, there's something better. And so, waiting calls for us to think of time differently as well, where we do not become a servant of time, but time serves us as we wait, as we're patient. I like to talk about how, I'm actually Gen X, but, millennials, and really, I think all of culture, millennials and Gen Zs now, and, college students were born after 2000 now. But we created this thing called the microwave to, so we could bake potatoes in 3 minutes rather than 45 minutes. We create a lot of things, and some of them are great, obviously, again, but we don't know how to wait. We don't know how to abstain either. We just don't know how to wait. And so in entering the Advent story, it's asking us to slow, to wait, to see, is there something better in Christ that we can hope for and lean into and long for in our world today?
Mhm. So I'm wondering in this practice of waiting, um, how you don't become the theologian who stole Christmas, which I just love that the title of that chapter, the theologian who stole Christmas. Um, how would you recommend to folks who are participating tonight, who are in here? How do we practice this waiting and this disconnecting from the consumerism without becoming Grinches, killjoys?
Yeah, there's a interesting little story, in the book. It's a play off both how the Grinch Stole Christmas and Charles Dickens's A Christmas Carol. I love more the latter than the former. I know a lot of people, they know the story, they watch the Jim Carrey movies and various things, but yeah, in starting out the book that way, it could feel like a sucker punch, of like, man, you're telling us to stop with the twinkles and the and all the beautiful things. And that's not what I'm necessarily saying, although I leave that in people's hands to decide what they need to do. So I know I will have a tree with lights. We will give gifts. So, but it can feel like, stop. And in a sense, I am asking us to stop with some things or reconsider other things. And so it can come across as a kind of, grouchy preacher saying, don't do those naughty things. But I also think, at least my experience in trying to enter the Advent story and telling the story, and I love reading the children's Bible with my kids and having a little Advent, wreath as best we can with the candles and them fumbling on trying to light it every Sunday, and reading maybe in the Message version of the Bible, it is drawing us into something like the wonderment there is just, I think, amazing. And that's what I do in the rest of the chapters, is try to take us into certain things, to feel things and to think about things and to experience and say, how does this relate to where I am, to where we are at in society and stuff. And so, yeah, I'm hoping people can get past and not see me as a Grinch.
Well, one of the ways I think of you as not a Grinch in terms of this book is that you're, and this is a connection with the Christmas Carol story as well, is that both the Grinch and Scrooge call us to isolation.
Okay.
About both of those characters, they're isolated, and they're isolated by in Scrooge's world, he's isolated by greed and penny pinching, and the Grinch is isolated by, I guess, by bitterness, but that he tries to compensate for by meanness and being a bully. And so what the story that you're inviting us into with Advent is a story that's filled with connectivity and with community, and I think that's a powerful contrast between the isolation of a Scrooge and a Grinch, and the connectivity and the community that comes in the body of Christ.
Yeah.
And we have trouble connecting when we don't wait, and when we try to fill our lives with things rather than taking the time to be in relationship with each other. But I think that comes out in your book, particularly in how you help people enter into the connectivity and the community, the context of the Christmas stories. So I wonder if you'd say a little bit about how you think about that context in which the Christmas story takes place. Because one of the questions I had was about how's it difficult for us to enter into those Advent stories, and the difficulty of entering in is what leads us to maybe not be so patient and not to wait. So I threw a lot out there, so go with what you want.
Well, I'll start with Leviticus. No, I won't. On some level, I think we think it's easy to enter the Christmas or the Advent story, which, a lot of times see those merging together because they're the easiest part of the church's story to tell. If people aren't involved in church, they'll at least maybe go for Christmas and Easter. And my background of my church that I've been in for many years now, we only knew to celebrate Christmas and Easter. We didn't know what anything else, and we thought it, typically look down on it. So I think there's a level of opening Matthew's gospel or opening Luke's gospel and thinking, oh, precious moments, that version of the Bible, and Jesus meek and mild, and Silent Night. I don't think it was a silent night, at least as far as I know. We've had 3 kids and it wasn't silent, but and I understand what it's communicating in the carols, and I love Christmas carols, and my mom used to sing Silent Night to me even when it wasn't Christmas as a way to help me rest and calm. And so in a sense, maybe we think that they're easy, and so I'm trying to make us feel that maybe they're not as easy as we thought. And one of the ways I do that is I start with Matthew 1, but I don't jump to verse 18, which is where most sermons will start, because verses 1 through 17 have a whole lot of names, of which maybe 3/4 of them we don't know how to pronounce. We see David and we're like, yes, I know that name. And, we see Abraham's name, but we don't, some of these others and these kings and these people throughout the history of God's people. And so I try to set the scene of Christmas in a unfolding story that's been going on for a long time for the Jewish people, and particularly their story. And Jesus didn't drop out of nowhere. He was embedded. As I like to remind my students, Jesus thought like a Jew. He ate like a Jew. He spoke like a Jew. He smelled like a Jew. That may sound weird. He dressed like a Jew, and he walked into a situation that was very painful, was very hard. The people felt bullied. They felt beat up. That was their story. And it was their story. There was an empire called Rome at that time, we probably know. And so there's a lot of, in that story, there's a lot of frustration. There's a lot of pain. There's a lot of resentment. There's a lot of questions and confusion. So there you go. I don't know if I've answered you, but other than to say, talking about that context and relating it to our own, is we live in a context, and 2020 is exceptionally, Y2K came 20 years late, I guess, but 2020 if there's anything, this, we can feel the pain, the frustration, the anger, the confusion, the whys that the Jews in Jesus's day were filled with as well. So.
That's a very helpful connection of that the time into which Jesus was born and the context into which Jesus was born was a time of oppression, of upheaval, of lots of questions and questions about where is God in all of this as well. I mean, if we're the chosen people, why are we under the thumb of the Romans? And it's not a very pleasant thumb to be under. It's more like being under the heel of the Romans. And so one of the interesting Hebrew Bible connections you make, which doesn't often get connected with Christmas, certainly, but we're talking about Advent, but still that Christmas is lurking there, is is Lament and Lamentations. And so if waiting is a spiritual practice associated with Advent, another practice that you talk about is lament. So share a little bit about what lamentation is and why lament is an important spiritual practice connected to waiting and Advent.
Yeah. So lament is like liturgy is another word that we're not maybe used to. We don't know that the Psalms actually are the highest kind of category of poems and prayers in there are laments. They're not praise. And so the Psalms are a very big place to embed when it comes to lament. Laments are cries or complaints, literally. There's a book called Lamentations right after Jeremiah. It's a little book. My church is doing a series on it. I'm going to talk about Lamentations 5 to end out this Sunday. And I would say lament is biblical, that lament is prayer. Lament is honesty. And lament is also healing. I don't think we can get to healing and to come through what we're walking through without some kind of grief and lament. But we don't maybe know how to. I think we push it down, we sweep it under the carpet, we put on the hi, I'm fine face. And so I think Advent calls for some sense of lament because there's a waiting, and there's a waiting for God's salvation, God's deliverance through Christ. They were waiting 2,000 years ago. We are still waiting now for things to be tied up and made new, and Jesus make all things right. And we feel that lament. I hope we feel it now, but just a little commentary on current culture. I think we're fighting more than lamenting. And I think we're used to the church having the kind of rule of the land. And this isn't the 1970s and 80s, even the 1990s. And, perhaps we shouldn't be fighting as we should be more lamenting and feeling the loss and the confusion and the frustration and bringing it before the Lord on some level. And so, I think we're in a season where we should be lamenting. And I don't know if we're doing that well because we don't know how to. We don't know how to express pain and be honest. And as Eugene Peterson said on some of these Psalms, is learn how to cuss without cussing. Sorry, that's the way. He has a great conversation with Bono, the lead singer of U2, and they talk about the Psalms and some of the painful Psalms. And they find a way to bring voice to our hurt and our pain.
Mm-hmm. I wonder how much that might be connected to this sense that when we go to God in prayer, we're almost afraid to bring our whole selves. Like, it's like going to church on Sunday and we dress up, at least traditionally, you dress up for church, you put on your Sunday best, and you certainly don't show within your church community that you're having any problems. You're supposed to be saved, you're supposed to be whole. And so we can't bring that to the church. And so we don't bring it in prayer as well. So I'm just wondering if what is it that's preventing us from lamenting within the church, within our lives as people of Christian faith?
I guess there are a few initial thoughts. I don't think we talk about it. And so if you don't talk about something you don't know, the awareness is not there when certain things aren't talked about. So we don't have an awareness, we don't know. I do think in a sense, it has to be modeled by people that are kind of standing in the forefront as leaders. And of course, leaders, having been there myself, we feel we have to kind of put on the face, stay strong. And there's a sense in which leaders are called to be strong when the people are hurting, and to provide direction. But there's a fine line there. And I think one of my pastor talks a lot about the triumphalistic views of American, and that's not even in like what we may call Pentecostal charismatic churches, is that we live under the American dream, the myth of the American dream, and that we can make it. And if we pull ourselves up by our bootstraps, push down all the stuff, all the pain, all the anger, all the fear. And so we've been trained well, and it comes at us on so many levels. And so I don't know, those are a few thoughts of why I don't think we know. And part of the awareness, go back into it, like we don't think we're allowed to, we're invited to. Mm-hmm. And God is the most secure being. And I know there's a fine line maybe on some sense of raising your fist to God, but I still believe God is the most secure being in the entire world existing. And I think he can take our pain and our frustration and our anger and our fear and our all of that.
Mm-hmm. There was a connection that I saw with what you were writing or wrote about in Lamentation, with a book, also a short book. Author is Pierre Wolff, Wolff. And the name of the book is May I Hate God, which is a great provocative title. But it seems to me that it's connected with lamentation that brings us to the cusp of sort of saying to God, what the hell? What's going on here? Like how the book of Lamentations ends, and we were talking before we went live about the last two verses of the book of Lamentation, which are basically, you may turn to us or you may not. This may continue, God, and we don't really have an answer to that. But one of the things I like about Wolff that I think is reflected in the realism of Lamentation is that our deepest anger with God comes from our deepest desire for God in our lives. That the two are connected, so that we can't lament to God unless we expect God to do better. Just like we can't wait for Christmas unless or wait for salvation, unless we expect salvation. And that's where I see that connection with, as you talked about, the connection between waiting and hoping. This is just really powerful, so powerful to think about those connections. And I see them as you talked about some of the other characters in the Advent part of the story of like Zechariah and John and Mary, and maybe we could just do a little segue at this point into that character of Zechariah, because he's so interesting in this connection to lamentation and waiting and hope. What do you see in Zechariah that folks should hear about?
So for those who aren't familiar, Zechariah was the dad of John the Baptist. And whereas in a lot of times we think of silence as a very wonderful spiritual practice, and it is. I think we need more silence in our world today, but I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole. John's father, Zechariah, is given silence by the angel because he is not responding to the promise of God like he should. And it seems pretty harsh because other people question. The angel shows up, offers them this great message about his son and so forth, and it's coming, and Zechariah kind of questions it, and they're like, well, other people question, they didn't get silence. And I kind of link it to what I think's going on with highlighting who John is, his name, and so forth, which speaks to grace, and that his family would now be, their disgrace would be removed because they now have a child. And but Zechariah has to wait, and he has to wait for his voice to come back. As far as we can tell, he does well waiting. He takes it. He takes his discipline, and he learns. And at the time when he's asked, hey, what's the name that we're really supposed to give this child? Because they don't like the name John. And he's like, he writes down John on his, well, they didn't have iPads at that time, whatever they had. And he writes it down and shows everybody, and like, what? And boom, right then he can speak. And he moves straight into giving thanks and praise and like, yes, thank you, God. And so he's having to wait. And I think it's a really good pointer. And the people of God are having to wait. And when John the Baptist hits the scene and is compared with Elijah, it twigs something in the Jews' mind, because they know when Elijah comes back, the waiting is supposed to end. They've been waiting hundreds of years. Malachi, the last prophet of the Old Testament, had said that somebody like Elijah would return, maybe even Elijah himself. And so John the Baptist comes. His father has a waiting period, but John the Baptist in particular brings an end to a waiting period that's centuries long. And so there's a lot of waiting tied up into the story of John the Baptist.
Yeah. And he's just in and of himself, John the Baptist is a pretty fascinating character. What do you like about John the Baptist?
Well, I think he had a good beard and he ate some nice food, but it's like the typical idea of a prophet. And we're like, he probably was like John the Baptist, big beard, Hagrid looking figure from Harry Potter, I suppose. But regardless of what he looked like, and some of the things intentionally that he had gone maybe out in the wilderness away from people, and some of his own practices, I look at the book, at least I look at him as a kind of model for the church, as people wait and prepare for Christ's second coming. is to look at John the Baptist, and the angel talks and speaks to him, and or the scripture from Malachi is also brought in, and that he is a preparer and a restorer. John the Baptist, that's kind of is applied to his life from the scripture in Malachi, that he would turn people's hearts in the families back to one another, restoration. He would draw people back to wisdom, that would be restoration. But there's also that scripture from Isaiah that talks about him, one from the wilderness, preparing the way for the Lord. And so John the Baptist may, I think, as he was for Christ's first coming, that we could look at his life and think, well, what does that mean for us as the church preparing the way and being a people of restoration in our world today?
Yeah, and how are we called, like John the Baptist, to make the way? I mean, we're supposed to, of course, we're following the way. It's sort of this interesting dynamic of we're following the way of Jesus, and yet we need to make the way. And certainly John the Baptist is a fascinating character in that both we're waiting for Jesus, and yet he's here. And then, I mean, this goes beyond the Advent story, but it's one of my favorite gospel stories of when John is in prison. He's been imprisoned by Herod, and he sends his disciples to Jesus and his disciples and asks, "Are you the one?" And Jesus's response is to describe what he is doing. So go back and tell John these things are happening, and people are being healed, that the lame can walk, the blind have had their vision restored. And we don't really get John's response, if I remember right.
Yeah.
And the next thing we hear about John is that he's been beheaded. And of course, Jesus goes into mourning from that. But there's this connection between those two, from the womb to the tomb. There's and he's just a powerful, powerful figure, and one who waited, and waited and waited, even as he was proclaiming, which is, I think, interesting. Another person who waits, that you talk about, is Mary. And I'm wondering about how you see her as important for our spiritual lives, for our life of discipleship. What does she teach us?
Well, one of the things I tried to focus in on the Mary account is, I start with a story of just imagining our own lives, and just in the normal sense, Mary and the unassuming, the normal and the unspectacular, that the angel appeared to her, nothing, which would be similar to her son, Jesus, who's to be born, nothing that would, in appearance, that would draw us to Christ, nothing in appearance that would draw us to Mary. She's getting on. Some people project she was maybe her in her mid-teens at that time, which was not uncommon. Though I do know that my great grandmother got married at 13 years old. That was back in 1914, but it's a different day, and definitely in that culture a much different day. But there she was, probably just getting on with life in the home. Nothing great, nothing special, unassuming, unspectacular, and the angel shows up. And I talk about also, Mary was a woman. We know that men ruled the world at that time. Not only she was a woman from Nazareth, which Nazareth didn't have a great tag to it. We know about that with Jesus as well. And things that people say about him, and also from Galilee, Nazareth and Galilee. And so there's kind of this three strikes you out kind of thing about Mary that really doesn't help the story. And then dadgummit, she goes and gets pregnant in a way that is very odd. And so there's just so much that says, don't look at this girl. There's so much that says nothing to see, nothing to look at, nothing important. But yet Jesus, and I talk about this in other chapters as well. I'm sorry. Yet God moves in her life, works in her life in a way, and God is always pleased. And really, that's what's said over Jesus's life, is that he would flip the script, and the low would come up, and the hungry would be fed, and the poor would be raised up. And here's Mary, the mother of Jesus, who is going to be living out really what her son is going to be living out as well. And God chooses this unassuming woman to do a really powerful work in a way that we're just so used to the story, it doesn't shock us anymore. It's like, oh yeah, nice little Mary. But to really feel what was going on that day, I think calls for us to kind of be shocked and taken back and think, this is just odd. This is not right. What do you mean, God? You can't do it that way, God. You got to check in with our council first. And, God really shocks the people in that way.
Yeah, and one of the, I think, powerful things in this book that you've written is the way in which you connect these biblical characters to the ordinariness of our lives, and sort of how they were unassuming. These were not powerful people. They weren't, high up in their own society. They were the lowly. And this is where God chooses to enter into our world. And towards the end of the book, I'm jumping towards the last chapter. You have this really powerful reflection that you're drawing upon Henry Nouwen, that it said, it's on page 105 if anybody's following at home. God in Christ has moved into what Henry Nouwen called downward mobility. In his work Here and Now, following a few reminders of Christ's teaching on humility and service, Nouwen remarks, quote, "This is the way of downward mobility, the descending way of Jesus. It is the way toward the poor, the suffering, the marginal, the prisoners, the refugees, the lonely, the hungry, the dying, the tortured, the homeless, toward all who ask for compassion. This way of being is very different from the life of success, popularity, or power, as Nouwen terms it. This kind of life may be very different from what we even see in the church." I'm thinking about if that's the center of the Christmas story of Christ, who is the second person of the Trinity, the Son of God, entering into our humanity, and it's not just sort of humanity in general, but there is that, but it's entered into the lowest of humanity. What does that say to us for our Advent and our Christmas, much less our lives as Christian disciples?
I think it makes us uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm.
I think it asks us to change how we talk, how we think, how we act. Honestly, as you were talking, I was rereading that, and I'm kind of nervous and scared to think of even saying this, because okay, what am I going to do? And maybe I'll be at the Manna House tomorrow, and I've worked with homeless shelters a lot, but I'm thinking like Christmas Day is on the streets with the homeless.
Mm-hmm.
Christmas Day is, and I totally believe in celebrating with family and the beauty of that. And so it may not be Christmas Day, but the season of Christmas. And lo and behold, Christmas actually does last 12 days.
Mhm.
That's why we have the song on the first day of Christmas, my true love, and we go through that. There's 12 days, so to find ways, and I think even is it the Feast of Saint Stephen where we recognize? Is that the one that we focus on? That's the church is focused on giving gifts to other people. I can't remember. Not our family, but the poor and the people who don't have, and to find in that season a way to bless, to pour, to take care of the hurting, the widow, the poor, the down and outs, the homeless, the sick. I just think that's the way of Jesus. We definitely don't need, but there are a lot of people who need right now. Um, and how can we do that? Um, in Matthew 25, we're faced with a question. And of course, coming from a Protestant evangelical, we're very like, wait, I don't earn anything. And I'm not asking people to earn their way into God's favor. God already loves us. But there's a real question put before them of like, and he says, you didn't, when I was hungry, you gave me food. When I was thirsty, you gave me food, drink. And when I was in prison, you visited me. And they're like, when, Lord? And it's like, when you did it to the least of these. And the people, the goats, are the ones that are put off to the side, that have the problem to deal with now of judgment. They're the ones, and they're like, but when did we see you? And he's like, but we didn't know these things. He's like, when you didn't do it to the least of these, you didn't do it to me. So we're really challenged if we want to do this thing the right way. Starting back at the beginning, we need, I think, on some level, to abandon the mall religion and consumerism and move toward the ways of Jesus more. And I think Advent and Christmas invite us into that story of knowing what he did and then also trying to walk it out as best we can by his power. So.
Yeah, I guess we don't really trust that we meet God in our vulnerability, our own personal vulnerability, but also in our shared vulnerability as human beings. I guess that's, connecting that to the story of Mary, that God enters into her, and I mean, she becomes the mother of Jesus by her willingness to be vulnerable, to take the risk of being 14, 15 years old and being pregnant before you're married. That's a huge risk, then and now. And how do we practice vulnerability if we're not even willing to wait, or to hope? And that, I think, is one of the things we don't trust, I guess, is that that's where joy and peace and favor is experienced. Is that, I don't want us to end on the sort of the Grinch, the theologian who stole Christmas, but the theologian who restores Christmas, which is, as you talk about in chapter 10, about joy, peace, and favor, and recognizing those in Christmas and in our lives as disciples of Jesus.
Yeah, and I like to say this. In America, we know how to party, and a party lasts for a few hours, and then we go to bed, and we forget the next day. Some people forget for certain reasons. Some people just move on to the next day. The ancient world knew how to celebrate. They knew how to go all out. They would do like full week-on festivals of celebrating and eating and drinking and dancing and fun. And they had these boxes on the side that they all put their cell phones in so they didn't get distracted. No. And they celebrated. And I think Christmas, and even my kind of encouragement or challenge to consider how to bless those who don't have a Christmas, it's to celebrate with these people, joyous, to be generous, because God has been generous to us. Therefore, we celebrate when we come through into Christmas after that waiting period, after that painful anticipation, maybe some lament. We come into Christmas, which then says, let's celebrate because of God's joy, God's shalom, his well-being, his peace, and God's favor, that he's shown kindness and goodwill toward us through Jesus. And so it's something to celebrate, and to celebrate with all types of people in a much more beautiful way. And we don't even have to buy $45,000 vehicles like the commercials maybe ask us, or and so I think we have a lot to celebrate and a lot to be festive, and to think of how we could celebrate Christmas for 12 days. That sounds more like the ancient people used to do than a real flurry of things for 3 hours on a certain day, eat and go to sleep. I'm kind of summarizing, generalizing, but yeah.
Well, we're nearing our end, so I'm going to lift up the book. And if you, Scott, could share the information about how one could order this book, Reflections of Emmanuel by Scott Lencke, which we've been talking about tonight with the author who's been here, Scott. How can people get a hold of this book? And I'd point out to folks that it's a good short read. So it's something that you could read through the course of Advent. It would be really excellent spiritual reading. So how can folks get a hold of this book?
Yeah, so it's not intense, I don't think. It's 110 pages-ish. And depending on how a person reads, some people could read it in one day very easily, but it's not meant to be read that way. But each chapter is 4 or 5 pages usually. But anyway, I just threw up a link, and that's actually to my website. And the only reason I do it there is you can see various links rather than trying to say, I mean, you can look on Amazon, Kindle, Barnes and Noble, any bookseller would have it, but there is some particular places I've got on my website if you click on there. And it's always cheapest to buy the book from me. I've got lots of copies. But it may just be easier to do a 2-day prime and get it over with. But there you go.
Well, Scott, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us tonight. Again, we've been talking about Reflections of Emmanuel by Scott Lencke, and really appreciate your insights into the season of Advent and how we can, within Advent, prepare for the coming of Christ in our lives. So thank you so much, Scott, and good night to you and to everybody else.
Yeah, thanks, Pete.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.